quilt I call just squares for obvious reasons. I've made a few of these, more than a few of these over the years, and the first time I made one, I had a bunch of leftover 2.5-inch strips, or parts of 2.5-inch strips. So I cut them all into squares and threw them into a box. Over the years, I've made other square quilts with 3-inch blocks, 5-inch blocks, and 6-inch blocks. It's a great way to use up scraps, and if you have an AccuQuilt, you can use up your scraps of all different shapes. Coming up is a 1-minute video. It's one of my early videos I've made, and it shows you how this is made. This is the Morning Star block. It's a 1-block quilt. It's made with light and dark scraps. And I use the AccuQuilt to piece this, but there's also, in the description, there's a link to the full tutorial on this. And you can also download a foundation paper piecing pattern. This is an optical illusion quilt. There's no curves in it, but it looks like there are curves in it. This quilt I call Orphan blocks and Orphan units. Everyone has some. You make a block, you make an extra block, or you decide you don't like a block and you have leftovers. Here you see a variety of blocks and units. There's some rectangles at the top. There's 2 starry path blocks. I believe there's actually 4 in this quilt that I had left over, and a disappearing shoe fly block. And I just put them together. I want to make the quilt 60 by 80, so I did it in 20-inch chunks about, and I just added things together and until it was 60 inches wide and about 20 inches tall, and then I sewed them together to make the length. And see, there you can see some 4 patches, some flying geese, and some units that, you know, people even give me some units and pieces sometimes, and I just put all of them in here. There's a lot of leftover rectangles in here, and I'll show you a rectangle quilt. Actually, I did several of those. So gather up all your Orphan blocks and all your Orphan units and put them in together, and you'll have a quilt. Here's the binding. I used a gingham check on the binding. And there's another starry path block. And there is something that someone gave me, so I just put them in there. And this is from the Scrap Garden quilt, and it will be coming up in a bit. There you have the Orphan blocks and Orphan units quilt. I call this quilt Scrap Garden, and it's made completely with scraps. The top is. And it's an optical illusion quilt. There are no curved seams in here at all. And how you achieve the optical illusion is through the use of light and dark fabrics. There's not too many medium fabrics in here, so the contrast of the light and the dark gives you the optical illusion, the illusion of circles. The blocks finish, there are 2 different blocks, and they finish at 9 inches. They're set 7 across and 9 down, and the quilt finishes at 63 inches by 81 inches. I really got carried away cutting 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch rectangles. I had so many scraps. I just kept cutting and cutting and cutting. So the first quilt I made is this. It's sort of a rail fence. So I cut a bunch of rectangles and I just picked them up and I just started sewing them together in pairs. And then I just sewed the pairs in sort of a rail fence kind of thing. And all of these quilts are roughly 60 by 80. That's about the size I make these quilts. And here's my little binding, a little multicolor binding and the backing. So the next quilt is coming up that I did with the other rectangles. And I had some gray fabric and I thought, well, let me just alternate the rectangles with the gray fabric. So this is what I did. And I used up most of my rectangles, but as you saw in the earlier, the Orphan block quilt, there were some in there too. So I'm really happy with how these turned out. They're nice. They've been washed several times. So those are the two rectangle quilts. This is my Tumbler quilt, and I had a bunch of odd-shaped pieces that were too difficult to cut into squares, but then I used my AccuQuilt tumbler die, and there are 3 pieces you can cut on the die, and you can stack your fabrics 6 high. You can layer the 6 fabrics. So that gives you 18 tumblers through one swoop, and I just needed something mindless to work on, so these just went together really well, and it helped use up all of my odd scraps. So if you have a lot of odd-shaped scraps, and if you have an AccuQuilt, that's great. They'll cut really fast. But if you're going to use a template to cut your tumblers or any other shapes, you might consider getting one of those rotating cutting mats. That'll make the job a little bit faster. But all in all, I'm pleased I was able to use up a lot of scraps, and I'm very happy with this quilt. This is my bow tie quilt. It's made from scrap strips for the bow ties, and the background is a white tone-on-tone. So for those of you who like the numbers, the blocks finish at 2 inches, and the quilt finishes about 67 by 81. There are 34 blocks across and 42 blocks down. So that's a total of 1,428 blocks. And here is part of the finished top. Now let's see the close-ups. This quilt is all half square triangles, and I think I cut these the same time I cut the rectangles. And what I like about half square triangles is you can put them in any setting that you can put a log cabin block. So this is the barn raising pattern or layout, and I really like it. It's a really nice quilt, and I used up a lot of scraps with this one. Now for the last quilt, I call this little rectangles, and these rectangles finish 1 inch by 2 inches. And I had this pattern I wanted to make where the rectangles were stacked on each other and formed like a diamond shape. And I also had this tone-on-tone white that I wanted to use for the background. But it was so tedious to put this together because I was following this pattern I had drawn out of the design, and each row was different, and it was just taking so long. I just told myself, you know what, I'm going to just add some borders and call it done.